1886, Wyoming, Ash Hollow, where the land doesn't forgive weakness or ask what you're looking for, where dawns sing in the language of dust and sunsets are as bitter as black coffee. A place that looks like the promised land, but demands everything, without abandon. Every year it only gets quieter here. Sand and rocks that have weathered their past leave empty footprints on a land that was once full of life. Everything stays in place here, even as this place fades into shadow, into oblivion, like the people that come and go, disappearing into this merciless silence. Maren Clark had always believed in the power of this land, stubborn and strong, like the very nature around her. But even stubbornness has its limits. Each day she tilled the land of their ranch again and again, digging deeper and deeper into the soil that gave her less and less. The cliffs were high, as if they were shrinking, and the wind here brought not just a chill, but a challenge that could not be passed without loss. The echoes of the attacks could be heard in every noise. There was the same van that had been burned when she and Tess had tried to leave the wounded farm. But they hadn't made it. Now Maren had no room for tears, only for work. Tess Clark, the younger sister, was different. A dreamer. She sat by the window at night, looking at the stars, and sometimes hummed softly to herself for comfort. Her song sounded like a kind of promise in the silence, as if the world wasn't so bad, if only she could hold it, catch it. But the shadow that hung over them was too big. It was too heavy. Tess believed in lucid dreams, but her eyes weren't naive. Every day she realized more and more that their lives were held together by a thin thread, and that thread was being torn more and more often. The earth was not spared, cattle were falling, and men in the neighborhood were leaving or disappearing. Was it curse or fate? Tess didn't know, but she knew for sure it wasn't just a fluke. The loneliness they felt with each passing year was becoming dangerous. So when, in the midst of winter, a rumor of new advertisements in the neighboring community, women looking for husbands to work with, Tess, for the first time, didn't dismiss the idea, didn't laugh. This time she took a closer look at the words that had seemed absurd before. Letters that had once been empty promises were now their last hope. Not for love, but for survival. Letters that could lead not to a fateful meeting, but to their ranch being protected. Men who could not just work, but stay. Men who could stay, because in this world, where unspoken threats permeated the air, only those who stay could win. Maren looked at Tess when she spoke of the letters. There was no more determination in her voice, only weariness, but in her eyes a dim light that was barely visible, but still burning.
Are you sure this is what we need?
Maren asked, not hiding her doubts. Tess was silent, then quietly answered,
We can't fight alone anymore, Maren. We can't.
and so the thought was born that the two hearts here on this troubled piece of land could no longer be the only protectors. The letter was all that remained between them and the abyss, and as cliché as it sounds, it was their chance. Night. The wind outside the windows pounded the shutters like thunder, but inside, in the dim light of the lamp, there was silence. Tess sat at her desk, her quill sliding across the paper, leaving a trail of words with an almost invisible hope in them. Outwardly she was calm, but her eyes seemed anxious, as if trying to trace the flames of the lamp, casting shadows on the walls, consuming the space. In the dark corners of the rooms, she couldn't help but feel their presence, their future. Tess wrote at length, picking out each word. She didn't know what they would find in return. She didn't believe in miracles, but she was looking for something more than help. She was looking for someone who wouldn't leave them. The letter was naively simple. There was no room for pretense, only reality.
We're not looking for a miracle. We're looking for someone to stay, who will not abandon us when the earth disturbs us again, and when this endless storm begins again. The earth doesn't forgive the weak, and we can't be weak anymore.
Tess set the quill aside and took a deep breath, staring at the lines. A shadow of doubt glittered in her eyes. But she couldn't go back. This was her decision. Inside, she could feel the despair turning to determination, and she knew, though she feared it, that she was doing the right thing. But the fear for the future grew with every word. Maren sat across from her, at the other end of the table. There was no quill in her hands. She sat staring out the window, where the outline of their ranch was barely visible in the night. Where once green fields grew and horses ran, there was now an emptiness that pulled everything down with it. She did not write at once. For a long time she only watched Tess write, her hand wavering between hope and reality. Maren knew they could wait no longer, but how hard it was to admit that their own strength was no longer enough. Maren didn't believe in letters, didn't believe in the men they could get. There was no room in her world for illusions. But she realized, too, that there was no other possibility. She took the piece of paper without thinking. The letter was short, direct, like everything she'd ever done in her life.
Maren, I will not lie. This is not an offer to find love. We're not looking for a miracle. We're looking for someone who is willing to work, who is willing to stay and protect. This is the land, and it demands everything. If you're willing to stay, then you're ready for something more than just a job.
She signed it without looking at the text and put down her quill. Tess looked up at her older sister, but Maren didn't meet her eyes. She could feel her gaze, but she couldn't respond to it. Everything had already been decided. The room became quiet again. They sat in that silence, as if in anticipation of a storm about to hit. The letters had been written. They had been sent. The next morning, Tess went into town, to the only post office. The days passed, and they continued their chores at the ranch in silence. Maren went back to repairing the fence. Tess walked around the house, checking to see if any boards had peeled off somewhere. It was a long, slow process, and neither of them said another word about the letters. But an inner storm raged in both of them, and in that moment they felt like the only thing keeping them on these lands was that faint thread of hope they had just released into the world. The calm before the storm. Almost 3 weeks passed before anything changed in their lives again. The wind continued to whistle across the empty steps, but inside the house everything was the same. The tired faces, the long days, the daily struggle with the land. But both women's hearts continued to beat in the same rhythm, and now that the letter had been sent, they could not go back. They had no other choice. The letters were gone, and now all that was left was to wait. The misty morning dawn was just beginning to dissipate when the train horn was heard from afar. It was a sound that seemed as likely to break the silence as an axe splitting wood. Ash Hollow hadn't had visitors in a long time, and the sound itself was unsettling, though no one spoke it aloud. Tess stood by the wooden platform, hiding her eyes behind her scarf. She couldn't help but notice how with each new honk her heart thumped in an anxious rhythm. Beside her, with an expression that didn't hide her anxiety, stood Maren. Her gaze was as blank as stone, steady, but there was a shadow of doubt lurking in it. Tess wrapped her arms around herself, trying to keep her invisible weight at bay. The dust from the train rose in the air, and under its influence, the world seemed to sink into a brief haze from which there was no escape. The train slowed down, and the wheels, grinding, came to a final stop on the platform. Before the train door opened, the air smelled of something distant. Lost. Tess, holding her breath, saw 2 men emerge from the shadows of the carriage. The first was tall and quiet. His movements were cautious, as if he sensed that every word might be too loud and every step too decisive. Elliot Drake. Outwardly, he looked like a man who had had more than one rough day in his life. Strong, but reserved, secretive, as if still reeling from some mysterious past he wasn't about to discuss. The other was low, with a cheerful grin and lightly swaying steps. Bow ready. His gaze, lively and open, hid something. He didn't lift his shoulders, didn't avert his eyes, but his eyes, they didn't tell the whole story. It was as if his past was there in the shadows of his face, and he hadn't yet dared to bring it into the light. They didn't say a word as they stepped off the train, like 2 extra weights who had thrown off the burden of the journey. Tess and Maren stared at them, wordless, but with many questions. No one smiled.
Will there be room for everyone here?
Tess asked mentally.
There won't be room for me in this if I don't do it right.
Maren thought. They met halfway. Bo tilted his head slightly, removing his hat. His smile was wide, but it lacked the warmth that could be called genuine. He said something like,
"Don't you think we're all almost late for our own opening act?"
Maren didn't answer. Her gaze was blank, but her eyes had already begun to search for the truth in his words. Tess, holding back her fear and excitement, smiled a little visibly. Elliot and Maren exchanged a brief glance, their eyes meeting, and there were more words in that silence than 1,000 conversations. But Elliot was silent, as if he was not at all ready to share their burdens. Tess noticed his silence. She couldn't understand why he didn't try to speak. The next week all life on the farm changed, no matter how much Maren tried to keep things under control. She watched Elliot as he worked silently in the field, asking no questions, seeking no help or agreement. His hands moved quickly, precisely, but no words, only action. There was something unnatural about it, but also soothing. Maren couldn't help but watch him. She knew that silence always hides something. A former preacher, or just a man who didn't trust himself? Whatever was in his past, it wasn't strong enough to destroy him here. Still, he was silent, and Maren believed that someone who doesn't talk about the past doesn't do so willingly.
He who doesn't talk about the past usually hasn't willingly forgotten it.
She had once said to Tess, watching Elliot, who lurked in the shadows, fiddling with tools, as if in that solitude he found his freedom. Tess glanced at her sister and did not answer at once. She was absorbed in thoughts of Bo, who in turn entertained her with jokes and stories. But every time he laughed, she noticed how his smile disappeared for a moment and his gaze became furtive. There was something in his eyes that she couldn't understand. And every day she tried to find the reason why he didn't talk about his past, what he was hiding behind that sincere but dangerous charisma. But she was in no hurry to ask. She wasn't ready to find out too much yet. The entire week had been filled with silence, work, tension, and uncertainty. And though Maren and Tess didn't talk about what they saw, what they felt, they knew one thing. Behind the silences and smiles were stories that would one day come out. And then it would be too late. But what would happen to them by then? The noise of the work on the farm gradually subsided with each passing day, but the tension in the air only grew. Life at Ash Hollow had always been demanding, but now added to the hard work was the need to hide what was hidden beneath the surface. Tess and Maren felt it as an aching pain that kept themselves hidden. Tess crept into the barn early in the morning when everything was still quiet. She tried to shake off the thought that there was a gulf between them and the men, but she couldn't. Every word, every invisible pause only reinforced the gap. And so, with childish curiosity, she reviewed the things Bo had left behind when he had gone to fetch firewood. On the corner of the table lay a locket, stained with dust, dull with time. Tess, without thinking, took it in her hand. She unscrewed the small lid. Engraved inside were the initials, J.C. Tess froze, her heart clenched. Why is he wearing a locket with someone else's initials on it? Her thoughts rolled like an avalanche, but she didn't know if she should show it to him. The find was unsettling, but she decided to wait until she had discovered the secret herself. Who else could it belong to? And why hadn't Bo told her about it? At that moment, her eyes fell on the locket again, and something pricked in her chest again. He was hiding more than he was saying. Meanwhile, Maren, making her way around the ranch with Elliot, noticed the man had taken off his shirt, underneath which was hidden a barely visible scar, a large, strange scar, wrapped around his arm. She held it up to the light and peered at it. It was a symbol she'd seen before, lines intertwining with each other, denoting not just a tattoo, but a marker of belonging, a symbol that was on inmates in a prison in the south, a prison for the highly dangerous. And it was all sneakily reminiscent of the period her father always talked about the rigors of that time.
You were in that prison?
Her voice sounded subdued, almost without intonation. Elliot, noticing that she was looking at his hand, pressed his lips together and didn't answer right away. He knew she would have to see that mark sooner or later. She was his past that he hid, not thinking it would ever come back again.
Is there something you want to ask?
His answer was cold, but not malicious. He didn't let his voice waver, but his eyes betrayed concern.
You didn't say you were in jail.
She said, not looking away. And you didn't say why.
I was the chaplain at the South Prison.
Elliot's voice was quiet, as if he didn't believe those words even as he said them. After what happened, I left. Lost everything. Faith, hope, family. Maren didn't react immediately, didn't say anything, just remained silent. There was a heavy weight in her gaze, like a stone she'd held in her soul since the beginning. Elliot looked at her and added, almost in a whisper,
I can't go back there. I can't be on the other side again.
Maren nodded silently and turned as something heavy rose in her chest. He stood before her, ready to tell her about his past, but knew his truth would not bring them closer. Still, she looked at his hand again, at that symbol. She didn't say a word, didn't pull him out of his silence, didn't try to guess what was behind his actions. She just knew that his past would stay with him. Tess, meanwhile, was looking at the locket she held in her hands. The sun was barely touching the horizon, and Tess, oblivious to the time, was deep in thought. She knew that one truth or another would come out soon, but it was too late to question Beau. The medallion spoke for him. Her intuition wasn't wrong. When the men returned with the firewood, Tess decided she needed to talk, but not until she looked at their faces. Their eyes no longer had the cheerfulness and ease she'd seen the first day. They had both become different. Beau looked away, but his face expressed nothing, just like Elliot's. Unable to stand it, Tess walked over to Beau. His gaze met hers, but this time he didn't avert his eyes. He stood as sturdy as ever, but there was something different inside him.
Are you going to tell me what this locket is?
Tess asked, squeezing it in her hand so that it was a little dimmer. Beau was silent, but a shadow flashed in his eyes. He knew the moment had come.
This is her locket, he said quietly.
She was mine, my wife, but I left her. Tess felt the ground go from under her feet, but she didn't look away. She stood in front of him, realizing that Beau wasn't what he seemed.
Why did you leave?
She asked, her voice trembling, but not from fear, but from something more.
I ran away, he said, not hiding the heaviness in his voice.
With the loot, but not the killing. I refused, and because of that, I lost everything. Those words came between them like a heavy stone. Tess didn't know what to think, but she realized his past wasn't just a mistake, it was more than that. Tess turned to leave and noticed that Maren and Elliot were already exchanging glances. They were united in their silence, but no one made a move. As difficult as it was, there was no longer the trust between them that there used to be. As evening descended on the farmhouse and the fire went out in the fireplace, everyone sat around the table, silent and tense. Without words, without hints, each of them realized that a choice had been made. The women were faced with a choice, whether to drive the men away or to give them a chance. But there was one thing for sure. Spring was coming, and they had to work together until then, and time would tell what would happen next. In any case, silence was more important than questions.
We work until spring.
Maren said, her voice heavy but determined. And we don't talk about the past. We can't afford to. It was a choice. A painful silence that for a moment became a bridge between them, though neither knew where it led. Snow had begun to fall as early morning, and by noon was turning every corner of Ash Hollow into a sea of white. The plateau where the farm was located was slowly being consumed by this continuous whiteness, hiding footprints and creating new ones, ruthlessly removing all signs of the former. The weather was not on their side, but even in such a blizzard it became clearer every day that hidden fears could not be put aside for later. Beau had become more taciturn in the last few days. He left the farm often, as if his soul was once again thrashing about in search of something that couldn't be found here. Even Tess could sense it, some dark foreboding that hung over them like a cloud. She tried to talk to him, but each time he answered coldly, as if he didn't want to talk about what he was hiding. And then, on the 5th day of snowfall, his past came back. And it came back with a bang. The gang that Bo had once associated his life with had approached Ash Hollow in full force, already late at night, as the wind howled through the empty terrain. They made no attempt to hide. The chase for Bo was a force that couldn't just disappear, and they didn't just want to find him, it seemed. They were going after what he had taken. Tess was standing at the window, looking around the lighted windows when she spotted the first silhouettes, the sharp shadow of a figure in the white snow. At that moment, Tess's heart clenched with anxiety. She sensed something was wrong. Bao was silent, but his gaze was pierced with a fear that could not be hidden.
They're here.
He said in a whisper, not taking his eyes off the window. Maren, listening to his tone, couldn't help but notice the tension that gripped his whole body.
Did you know they were coming?
Her voice was no more than a cold whisper. Bao was silent, but a shadow flashed in his eyes again. Maren realized the answer was obvious. He knew, and he hadn't told. What did all this have to do with him? All this time they'd been living under the same roof, and Bo had been hiding the truth.
You knew.
Maren took a step toward him, and her voice was filled with heavy pain.
You knew they would come.
He looked at her, and the look was full of regret, but there was no time for words. Footsteps were already sounding outside, the snow crunched underfoot, and Maren realized in that moment that it was all just a matter of time.
Get out to the barn.
Bao said sharply.
I'll cover you.
Maren wanted to object, but he was already out the door. In the same second, his figure disappeared into the snow. Outside, it was chaos. The blizzard obscured everything that was happening, but gunshots and screams broke the silence. Tess felt her heart start to pound faster and her throat dry with fear. They didn't make it to the barn in time. She could hear heavy footsteps thundering toward them and knew there was no way to escape.
Bao!
Shouted Maren into the darkness, but her voice was swallowed up by the blizzard. Before she could turn, figures in black cloaks, guns in hand, surrounded the house. Elliot jumped out of the shadows, gun in hand, his face focused, but fear in his eyes for those he cared about. He immediately stood beside Maren, covering her body with his own.
I knew.
He said, and his words sounded like an admission of guilt.
They were coming for us, for me, behind him.
You knew?
Maren couldn't believe it.
I knew, and I thought they wouldn't find us. We didn't get away.
Tess, standing in the corner, clenched her fists. She couldn't let this be the end of them. But what to do when an evil that couldn't be stopped was standing right in front of you? At that moment, as if from beyond the horizon, Bao appeared. He stood in the snow, his face pale and his gaze clouded with fatigue and pain. He grabbed his rifle, but before he took a step, a shot rang out. Tess cried out, and Maren turned instantly, seeing her sister fall. Everything went black, and her heart squeezed to the limit. She rushed to her, but immediately she felt a roar behind her. Gunshots from both sides, the blizzard, the cold, and that horror that was coming over them again.
Tess!
Maren screamed, clutching her arm, trying to stop the bleeding. Elliot covered their bodies with himself, with no thought for his own safety, and the shots became fiercer. They knew there was no time left. This battle wasn't about winning. It was simply for survival. At one point, Bo took a decisive step forward. He threw himself into the battle with a leadership amulet, shooting, swerving sideways. He was a silent killer, but today he was out of luck. Bao finished off one of the last of the men, massacring him instantly, and at that moment his eyes met Elliot's. Then he was gone. In that blizzard, in that snowfall, he was gone as if he'd never existed, without even turning around, without even explaining. Maren was left with a wounded Tess in her arms, with shreds of hope and bitterness in her heart. This was something they hadn't expected.
He's gone.
Elliot said, his voice now less regretful than calm. He knew it was inevitable.
Yes, gone.
Maren replied, her voice sounding muffled.
But he still hadn't left us.
Tess still hadn't regained consciousness. Blood soaked her clothes, and every breath was labored. Maren pulled her against her, and in that moment it was clear that their life at Ash Hollow was just beginning. But it was no longer what it had been before. The future was dark, and this snow that hid everything wasn't going to stop. Spring came slowly, as if nature itself was afraid to show its power, as if winter did not want to let go of its hold on the earth. The white snow was melting, but icy streams flowed through the earth, and every step was heavy, as if the earth itself was begging to be left alone. At Ash Hollow, the ground was thawing, but the signs of winter were still there. The grass had not sprouted, but was only quietly, reluctantly, rising from beneath the dirt. There was that slight uneasiness in the air that is inherent in every new beginning. Maren stood at the window, her eyes watching the first growth of grass, the mist that hung like a veil over the horizon. She was not yet accustomed to the silence that now reigned on the farm, though it had been a long time coming, and yet something was wrong. It was too quiet. Elliot stayed in the house, built at the very edge of the woods. He wouldn't live with them. They didn't discuss it. He wasn't their husband. He wasn't someone who could call himself the head of the family. But he was there for them. He became the protector, someone who worked and kept quiet, who demanded nothing in return but security. He spent hours in the workshop, chopping wood, fixing something that required no words, but his presence was as constant as the earth itself. He looked at the world as if he could calculate everything ahead, but even he didn't know how time would move. Maren didn't know what to feel. He hadn't promised her anything, and she hadn't asked for anything. Their relationship was not for words, not for vows. It was a union built on silent respect and mutual loyalty. It was loyalty not as a commitment, but as a way to stay. Tess, as always, was more open. She didn't hide her emotions, even if they were sometimes confused, like spring rain that promised cleansing but only brought new pain. She sat on a stone bench by a tree that once had her own mark carved into it, her own name. Tess stared at the horizon, where sky and earth merged into one, as if there, in the distant future, was where she belonged. And in that moment, Beau returned. It wasn't with an apology. He didn't come back with explanations, didn't come back with excuses for disappearing, for leaving them in the midst of winter, in the midst of fire and blood. He came back with a small box containing the remnants of gold, the very gold he had taken in that robbery, and a letter, shabby, scuffed, but with the clear message they had all been waiting for. He didn't say why he had come back. He didn't explain where he'd been or what he'd been doing. He just stood there, as if he himself didn't know how to start a conversation. Tess, out of habit, didn't try to speak. She stood up, walked over to him, and, as in those old days, took his hand, looking straight into his eyes.
You stayed.
She said, and that was all that was needed. It wasn't a declaration of love. It wasn't the words one usually says after a breakup, but it was everything to her. He nodded, almost imperceptibly, but it was a sign that he was willing to stay, willing to come back and find the strength to be there. He didn't apologize, didn't look for excuses. He was as reserved and silent as ever. But in his eyes was the same fire that had once brought him to their door. And now, despite everything between them, he stayed. Tess turned and looked out at the horizon again. Shadows were flickering, and it seemed like their whole life was like this long, grey winter day that couldn't end. But now there was something different in her eyes, something new, something like the future. Maren went to the window, and her gaze met Elliot's, who was sitting beside the fire, rocking his chair quietly. He didn't say anything to her, didn't ask her what she thought. He was the one who was always there for her, demanding nothing in return. He was, as before, her protector, the one who didn't promise the future but gave her a chance to experience the present.
Spring.
she said quietly, but there was no joy or despair in her words, only acceptance.
Yes, Spring.
He replied, lifting his gaze and hiding it behind the surface again. Tess and Bo returned to the house where the fire burned merrily. In that moment, there were no words, no explanations, no turning back. Bao stayed. Elliot stayed. Maren stayed, and they all stayed at Ash Hollow. Here, among these hills, among these trees and these rocks, anything was possible. But the important thing was that they were together, and there was more to it than any promise. Only spring could answer what came next. We don't choose who the wind will bring to our doorstep, but we do decide who to let in and who to keep out. It is not the strongest who remain in Ash Hollow. It's the ones who can keep their word. It's all behind us now. The letters, the searching, the questions, the doubts. Now all they could do was move forward, not in search of an ideal, but in search of something to hold on to, something to build, not on sand, but on this land that does not forgive weakness, but gives a chance to those who are not afraid of difficulties.